Joining us now, Rear Admiral Don P. Loren. He's also the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Admiral Loren serves as Strategic Advisor and National Liaison for Vets4Energy, a national group of America's veterans who believes national security is dependent on sound energy policy. Music to my ears. Admiral, welcome. Good to have you with us, sir.
Well, thank you so much. It's good to be with you this morning. I was fascinated listening to the lead-in. I'm happy to sit here and listen. Keep going.
Oh, well, thank you, Admiral. I really appreciate that. Do you think I'm right?
I'll stick with my comments on energy. Let's do that today. How's that?
Okay, that sounds good. So let's talk about energy.
There's no beer on the table. When there's beer on the table, I'll talk about anything you want to talk about.
That'll have to happen soon, Admiral, no question. I want to get to energy, though. Okay, so gasoline prices continuing to drop. People have short memories, Admiral, in America. I mean, I remember just a few years ago paying $4, $4.50. Okay, now, yesterday I got gas at Kroger, $1.87 a gallon. I remember during the 2012 presidential campaign, not that far back, right? Newt Gingrich campaigned on an energy policy to get gasoline down to $2.50 a gallon. Obviously, when you can produce your own energy and gas prices come down, it's good for national security. Now, I know you're involved in this. Can you elaborate on the whole strategy and why consumer gasoline prices have dropped now to significantly under $2? What happened?
Well, let me separate the discussion into sort of two fields, if I may. And you're talking about a very important consideration, and that's energy prices. And certainly the laws of supply and demand always drive those kind of prices. But don't forget, energy is a commodity, and there's fluctuations in the market, and there's so many different factors that play on the prices. So I don't want to get wrapped around the axle on energy prices, but I will say that one of the considerations in pricing, along with many other considerations such as access, certainly availability, the ability to have unrestricted flow and access to energy are all very important that go into these sort of factors. We at Vets4Energy, as you mentioned in the lead-in, we are a group of volunteer grassroots veterans that want to make sure, we like to think that we represent a large part of the 23 million veterans in our country today, a large portion of which are, of course, located down in your area where I used to live and love the Virginia Beach area. And the fact of the matter is that we want to make sure that the focus of the discussion on energy policy is that Americans recognize, regardless of what energy decisions we make at the federal, the state, the local levels, that we always include a discussion of the national security implications of those energy policies, because there is no group that knows better than we veterans the relationship, the inexorable link between energy policy and national security. Now, please remember, and I'll break off, I don't mean to be lecturing here, that national security is not just military policy. National security includes many of the things that your lead-in question sort of brings up. It's diplomatic policy, it's energy policy, it's defense policy, it's economic policy. And so there are many factors associated with national security. As you can see, if you read a document called the National Security Strategy of the United States, which is published with every administration, we're anticipating a new one coming out with the Trump administration, that looks at all these things and says, wait a second here, remember, our energy decisions are inexorably linked to national security. And one of the offshoots of that, of course, is the price and the accessibility to gasoline, the availability of it, the jobs created by it, the use of gasoline. So I know that's a long-winded answer to your very simple question on price.
It was good. So how does this tie in with the, I guess you want to call it the Trump Energy Doctrine, which basically what the president wants to do is continue to capitalize on our resources, our natural energy resources, whether it be natural gas or whatever, coal, anything. And he's saying that we can actually become a major energy exporter now. What you just outlined, Admiral Don Loren, how does that tie in with the Trump Energy Doctrine?
Great question.
Thank you.
The reality is that, first of all, I think, I don't know if all your listeners are aware of this, but the United States today is the leading producer of oil and natural gas in the world. Most people say, well, what about the Saudis and the Russians, the Venezuelans? We have surpassed all the nations in the world in the production of gas, natural gas and petroleum products because of technological advances, things like fracking and the ability to locate and develop energy resources. So we're now the largest producer. We still import way too much, but we will get off of that, and we have to work hard to weaning ourselves from energy from nations that may not share our values or may wish to do us harm. So the first element of that Trump doctrine, if you will, is the fact that we understand this. We have to capitalize on the fact that we are now the world's leading producer nations. So the reality is this is an integral part of the president's approach, understanding that we are an energy superpower. With that comes opportunities. With that comes responsibility. One of the other things I always like to mention in discussions like this is there is nothing within the view of your listeners out there right now that is not produced, manufactured, transported, or even grown without energy. We are an energy nation. Our life's blood depends on it. We have become complacent with the access and availability to energy, but energy drives our lives. And in fact, the Department of Defense is the largest consumer of energy in the United States today. So the reality is, again, I'll go back to the basic premise of Vets4Energy, that energy policy decisions are national security decisions, and any discussion of energy policy decisions must always include considerations of the impact on our national security, our defense, our economy, the jobs availability for our veterans, which is very important to us. So these are all critical factors.
Admiral, let me just ask you this question. You talked about the U.S. becoming, right now, is the #1 producer of energy in the world. Why do we still have to buy oil from OPEC?
Well, again, let me fall back on the position as I did on the pricing. You know, remember, commodity dealing is a very complex issue, one that I'm certainly not qualified to be able to analyze to the great extent. So there are arrangements, there are trade arrangements, there are relationships between nations where this is all part of the consideration. And still, remember, even though we have we have gained this position of being world energy leader, our energy policy has not been particularly coherent for the past 8 to 10 years. And so the reality is we really need to sit back and look at what we're doing with respect to a sound policy. And I firmly believe that's what the Trump administration is starting to do. So we're on the cusp of learning how to be this responsible energy superpower and what to do with it. Plus, there are lots of other considerations as well. Remember, a lot of this depends on infrastructure, the ability to move the energy around, and we still have significant infrastructure challenges in the United States. The difficulties we've had in the past with pipelines, the rail, dependability on rail transport, the ability on refineries and access to fineries. So it's a very, very complex issue, and you just don't turn on the dime immediately, having now garnered this position as energy producer and solve all the problems. But sound energy policy with the basic foundation and understanding of its imperative associated with national security policy will help us not only develop those policies, improve our national security, but lead us to the decisions which will wean us off the import of foreign oil and the ability to use oil to meet our needs and to support our friends and allies. You know, here's an issue, of course, that's very important to Virginians. I just live up at the top of the state here now, and of course, it's very real to all of you. And that's seismic exploration and offshore drilling. Remember, we've had a ban on that from the previous administration.
Right.
When you look at that, first of all, it takes somewhere between 7 to 10 years once you have located sources of energy, natural gas, oil, to produce and develop those resources. Well, if you have a 7-year ban on it, you only push that further out. And our understanding of those deposits and resources is old. It's based on 30-year-old technology. And we must always be exploring and testing and understanding what energy sources are available to us as a nation. And so we have done things. We have enacted policies that set back the access and the availability to that offshore energy that puts it back in the 15-year time frame. And we can't afford to do that. We need unencumbered access to energy. Let me also say, please, that while a lot of this discussion has been centered on oil and natural gas, which of course makes up the predominant part of our energy usage, because that's where we are today. The reality is, we as Veterans for Energy, we are an all of the above energy advocate. We think sound energy policy has to be tied to oil, to natural gas, to fossil fuels, but also must account for using all forms of energy: renewables, solar, wind, geothermal, nuclear, you name it. The reality is, we need to harness the energy resources that we have as a nation and use them to our advantage, use them wisely, and yes, be good stewards of the planet in the process of doing that. One other thing you touched a little earlier in your comment, which we haven't talked about at all, is coal. We are blessed with tremendous coal resources in the United States. And the question becomes, why are we not devoting the time, the energy, the scientific research to be able to use that coal cleanly, effectively, without polluting the environment as good stewards? If we have that much coal available to us, it's our responsibility to be able to figure out how to use it to our advantage, yet use it wisely, responsibly, cleanly. We're Americans, for goodness sake. We can do that. And one of the things, so you can see how these things are tied and how they're related to national security. Right. One of the reality is, as a capitalist nation, how do you promote the research and development for burning coal cleanly, or for finding new sources of energy, or for investing renewables? Well, you do that from the profits associated with selling the assets that you have now. So decisions we have that hamper the use, the export, the production, the development of energy that we have at hand indirectly, directly, affect our ability to invest in future forms of energy. So it's a vicious cycle, and we need to understand this when we make decisions such as promote the bans on offshore drilling. Any of the profits we make from development of those products get reinvested, a good portion of it get reinvested in the development of other sources. And all too often, we believe the federal government is the font of all R&D and all investment. And the reality is, the contributions to that investment in R&D by the federal government is minuscule compared to that of private industry and the energy industry. So again, this is all related type stuff, and we have to be cognizant of it.
All right, Admiral, I've only got one more minute. I got a text question here from Glenn in Chesapeake, who says, can you ask the Admiral about the Fitzgerald collision investigation? From his perspective as a retired Admiral, what does he think about the whole thing?
Well, you and your listener can ask me anything you want. Whether I'm going to answer it or not is another question. Certainly a tragic occurrence, and I just saw yesterday that the Navy appointed a flag officer as the senior investigator, and I know they'll get to the heart of the matter. It's something that all of us seafaring people desperately try to avoid, those types of accidents and, in particular, loss of life. And I'm confident the Navy's going to get to the bottom of it.
All right, that's going to be it. We want to thank Admiral, retired Rear Admiral Donald P. Loren, for being with us today. You want more information? Go to Vets4Energy.com, Vets4Energy.com. Admiral, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, we'll definitely have you back.